most, if not all, of the fellows joining us. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us all virtually. The second really cold, snowy Thursday in a row. So hopefully this is it for a while, but it's Michigan, so who knows? This could go on for another 6 weeks. But anyway, today we have Kyle Berry with us. He's the regional director for behavioral health in medical education, so part of our GME department. And he's agreed to speak with us on anxiety, depression, and existential crisis. So thank you again, Kyle, and I'll turn things over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know who I am a psychologist. I work predominantly with family medicine, but part of my role is for all GME stuff across West Michigan. So as we move through this today, if there are things that come up that you want more information about, please let me know and reach out, and I can either come back another time or we can set up a time to meet individually and go through some of that. So our kind of general objectives today is talk about depression and anxiety and how that relates to existential issues. I steered away from doing psychopharmacology. I steered away from doing kind of classic anxiety and depression conversations because I think that what you're asking for is a little bit different than that. But if I skip something and you're like, hey, there was like a piece that didn't feel like it connected, let me know and I'd be happy to go back and find it for you. There will be some questions at the end of this. I don't like these questions to be a big surprise. So generally what I want you to walk away from this is thinking about when we talk about depression, is hopelessness and powerlessness always pathological? And when people want to avoid and deny important things in their life, such as they are alone, they will die, and that they need others, will they then get anxiety from that? And what are the big four existential themes that Irvin Yalom proposed? This I'm just going to leave up on the screen. So if the screen doesn't change for a couple minutes, that's on course for the goal. I want you to see this. This is a way of taking a look at how consciousness lays out across kind of existence and time. And so Dan Siegel does a lot of work with this. I think the important part to look about is that there is just this infinity of possibility. And then when we get certain states and beliefs about who we are, we start to build up certain platforms that then have areas of peak activation in our life. And so I'm going to read you some thoughts about some really important parts about who we are as people, because I think development is super important when we're talking about how do you actually talk with people about what's happening to them and what they're struggling with beyond their physiology and what you're already treating medically. Attachment is the drive for closeness, proximity to others in not only the physical but the emotional sense as well, to facilitate either caretaking or being cared for. Without reliable adults moved to take care of us and without our impulses to be close to those caregivers, we simply could not survive, not for a day. Hardwired into our brains, our drive for attachment is mediated by vast, complex neural circuits governed in promoting behaviors designed to keep us close to those with whom we cannot live without. For many people, these attachment circuits powerfully override the ones that grant us rationality, objective decision making, or conscious will, a fact that explains much about our behavior across multiple realms. Everything from crying to cuteness to unignorable cues babies transmit is an inbuilt behavior tailored by nature to keep our caregivers giving and caring. But the need for attachment does not expire once we're out of diapers. It continues to motivate us throughout our lifespan. What distinguishes our earliest attachment relationships, and crucially, the coping style we develop to maintain them, is that they form the template of how we approach all our significant relationships long after we have grown out of the do or the die phase. Other core need, other than attachment, is authenticity, the quality of being true to oneself and the capacity to shape one's own life from a deep knowledge of that self. At its most accurate, concrete, and pragmatic, it means simply this: knowing our gut feelings when they arise and honoring them. To be authentic is to be true to a sense of self arising from one's own unique and genuine essence, to be plugged into this inner GPS and to navigate from it. A healthy sense of self does not preclude caring for others or being affected or influenced by them. It is not rigid, but expansive and inclusive. Authenticity only dictates that we not externally impose expectations, be the true author of and authority on our own life. The dilemma is this: what happens if our needs for attachments are imperiled by our authenticity, our connection to what we truly feel? What happens, in other words, when one non negotiable need is pitted by circumstance against the other? These circumstances might include parental addiction, mental illness, family violence, poverty, overt conflict, profound unhappiness, or in the case of today, the work that all you do in hospice and palliative care. The stresses imposed by society on children as well as adults are included here. Even without these, the tragic tension between attachment and authenticity can arise. Not being seen and accepted for who we are is sufficient. So children often receive the message that certain parts of them are acceptable while others are not. A dichotomy that, if internalized, leads ineluctably to a split in one's sense of self. The statement, good children don't yell, spoken with annoyance, carries an unintended but most effective threat. Angry children don't get loved. Being nice, read as bearing one's anger and working to be acceptable to the parent, may become a child's way of survival. Or a child may internalize the idea that I'm lovable only by doing the things that I do well, setting him or herself up for a life of perfectionism and rigid role identification, cut off from the vulnerable part of herself that needs to know that there is room to fail, or even just to be unspectacularly ordinary and still get the love that he or she needs. Although both needs are essential, there's a pecking order. In the first phase of life, attachment unfailingly tops the bill. So when the two come into conflict in a child's life, the outcome is well nigh predetermined. If the choice is between hiding my feelings, even from myself, and getting the basic care I need, and being myself and going without, I'm going to pick the first option every single time. Thus, our real selves are leveraged bit by bit in a tragic transaction where we secure our physical and emotional survival by relinquishing who we are and how we feel. As these patterns get wired into our nervous system, the perceived need to be what the world demands becomes entangled with our sense of who we are and how we seek love. Inauthenticity is thereafter misidentified with survival because the two were synonymous during our formative years, or at least seem so to our young selves. The internal adaptations that we make to our own personalities in order to survive adversity early in life carry the same risks as conditions shifts, but we are far less wise to the danger. It is sobering to realize that many of the personality traits that we have come to believe are us, and perhaps even take pride in, actually bear the scars of where we lost connection to ourselves way back when. So I think that part of what we're asking when we talk about existentialism is we're asking us to move very, very close to the core of human beings truly are, and at times to help kind of recapitulate or go backwards in time and heal wounds that happened to them beforehand, because now there is this time pressure to do that. So much of our life is just about the opportunities that we've had, the supports and the resources around the person, and so culture and language and so much more goes into our development. And there's just not really a simple way to grasp all that. And so I did some work with Chat GPT, and then I did some work by myself because, or Copilot, because Copilot was struggling with images. So this is a way of thinking about how do we develop kind of quickly across development and time. I think most people have this idea that there is some non-corporeal aspect to their being. And so if you want to call it a soul or a mind or your spirit or your cosmic connection, then there's this idea of temperament, which is what you're born with, kind of who you are as you come out, how your soul interacts with the embodied physiological structure that we call the human body. Then how does that soul within the human body interact with other people around them? And we do that through attachment. And so part of what you all are going to face regularly is this idea that people kind of regress back to these earlier attachment and authenticity places where these needs become actually higher than they have been for maybe 30, 40, 50 years for people. The next kind of piece of identity or personality that gets developed is gender, and that happens around 5 or 7. We kind of sense who we are at that point. It's sexual orientation is also around the same time kind of getting crystallized for us. We have an idea about when we look out into the world, what do we find attractive or what gives us butterflies in our stomach. All of those experiences with others get totaled out into this idea of an interpersonal style. And so our interpersonal style is just this unique way that we interact with other people across time. Under stress, we go to our most extreme parts of our interpersonal style. So if I am a maybe friendly and dominant person most of the time, I might become even more overbearing or aggressive in my attempts to be friendly and dominant and interacting with other people. And so sometimes the work that we have to do is in how do we respond to what we call hooks and invitations from the people that we interact with. So how do we respond to the hooks that our patients give us without doing a whole lot of unintended or iatrogenic things to ourselves and then with the relationship. So our interpersonal style gets mixed over time with lots of experiences. Those experiences happen within systems of privilege, power, and oppression. That can kind of get mitigated by another kind of mathematical formula I just made up, which is taking a look at our social determinants of health, which are typically kind of looked at as barriers to equity or barriers to well-being. And those kind of get mitigated by how many traumas that we have or haven't had in our life and whether we've been able to resolve those. And protective factors, the supports and resiliency and recovery that we've had mitigate a lot of that. What flushes out at the very end is a personality. Many people think that personality cannot be changed, but personality can be changed. We're looking at it as much more of a dynamic dimension than we are these discrete categories that we were thinking about 20 years ago. So, really, all personality needs to change is for a willingness and an openness. It also needs a couple basic formularies, which is also true to any existential work that we do. So Carl Rogers talked a lot about two people have to come together. One person has to agree to be the guide or the clinician or the doctor, and one person has to agree to be the seeker or the patient or the client. The caregiver needs to develop sufficient enough empathy and adequate enough empathy and display that to the patient that they feel it and that they demonstrate something called unconditional positive regard. And with those very simple constructs, even personality can change. And so when we look at existential stuff, it can feel like it's so big, but I want to try to pour it into a funnel today to say, yes, it can feel big and overwhelming. And there's places that we can stop along this hike and get some relief, get some guidance, get some ideas about how to move forward. I tried to break down how we look at the DSM because I think at times we are really intentionally confusing about how we talk about differential diagnosis. For a depressed mood, there needs to be a sad or depressed mood for 2 weeks for more hours out of the day than not, which is a change from previous function. And so those things are going to be consistent across all aspects of depressive disorders. You're going to be looking for a 2 week period of time because essentially what society and what psychology has been saying is you have 2 weeks to recover from a bad thing happening in your life. And if you're not sufficiently rubber banded, snapped back to normal, we can diagnose you with pathology. If it's grief, we'll give you 1 to 3 months. And then we say you got to be over it. And so there also is this kind of idea inherently built into all of this that we avoid talking and dealing with hard emotions as a society and as a people. Depression can also be a combination of self report and observed. And for a lot of men that I've treated, they do not endorse classic symptoms of depression, but they will absolutely endorse agitated or irritability, things aren't going their way, unstable relationships, unstable sleep, unstable GI, which as we move through here are like all the classic symptoms for depression, right? So I always ask myself if I can make a logical argument that the depressed mood is driving this behavior or cognitive cascade, or is it better accounted for by something else? And that's going to be consistent across every mental disorder. We always defer to medicine and say, is there a medical reason for this? Could there be a traumatic brain injury? Is this a substance or including the medications that we prescribe? Could this be coercion? Could this be psychosis? Could this be delirium or memory, etc.? And so we really want to rule out those things, and we can use tools to help us do that. One of the tools that I know that we have is the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7. There is also a PHQ-15 that looks at just somatic symptoms, and there's a PHQ SADS or SADS, which I liked using when I did clinical work. It's not in Epic, but you can find it on the Pfizer website and print it out. And it essentially combines the PHQ-15, the GAD-7, questions about panic attacks, and the PHQ-9. And so I really like it for that reason. The other thing I want to point out is when we talk about markedly, we're talking 2 standard deviations away from the mean when we use that term. The only other important things I think to really point out are things like hypersomnia and insomnia, or like an inability to stay awake. It's beyond like daytime fatigue, daytime sleepiness, or wanting to take a nap. And I used to correlate being fatigued with being tired, but I think I'm correlating it much more now with fatigue as a loss of energy. I took a shower, I got out, I couldn't dry my hair because I was too tired. Or I took a shower, I used the hair dryer, and I had to take a nap because I was physically exhausted. That's what we're talking about fatigue. It's almost this inability to push through it. Another interesting thing is it may be delusional and not merely self-reproach or guilt about being sick, which I think plays into what we're talking about within your field specifically. And I didn't go down the track of specifiers, but if we want to do that in the future, we can. I think the way that you can separate biological depression has more of a low mood and more neurovegetative change to it and a self-reproach. And it's not specifically reorganized around a theme like an existential theme. Like we'll get to these big four later. Existential despair is more of this like anhedonia, this like loss of pleasure in life, loss of purpose, can't find a meaning. It's more nihilistic, it's more ruminating. Excuse me. We're looking at wasted life, we're looking at shame, we're looking at issues around dependency and not wanting to depend on others and not wanting to be a burden. How does that relate to isolation? Those things are much more akin to existential depression than I'm depressed because my life is not going well, or I feel dead inside and my life is okay, which is what we see with a lot of like the walking well. So jumping to anxiety, it's persistent, it's insidious, it's spreading. It's like an intrapersonal infection, meaning inside the self. Anxiety comes from this place of acceptance. If you walk into a room and you feel accepted, you feel these people are like me or like-minded like me, anxiety won't be present. Fear, on the other hand, comes from external sources around things like spiders, heights, and that's a way to kind of separate those two things. Generalized anxiety, I wasn't going to talk a lot about this because, in my mind, and correct this assumption and bias if it's wrong, you guys aren't treating people for 6+ months in hospice and palliative care. That's going to be a very rare event. And then again, this can't be attributed to another substance or medical condition. And when I think a lot of what I assume are anxious thoughts that people are having in your service, it's going to be more about the big four than it is about going grocery shopping or being effective in my environment or being promoted at work, being successful in my marriage, parenting, these other things that are more generalized. The other thing about generalization is it goes across multiple events, activities, people, places, things. It's not specialized or specified. So OCD, really quickly, kind of have these two big things, right? You have these thoughts that get away from us and these behaviors that get away from us, and we have a hard time controlling either. A lot of people confuse obsessive compulsive disorder with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and they are very, very different things. OCD is almost magical thinking about both the omnipotence of consciousness and the flawedness of subjectivity. So you don't trust your perception or your observation of reality. It's almost a misapplication of a cognitive template. Um, OCD is also more about the time spent doing those compensatory strategies than it is about how long it's been going on across time. Like there is no duration that it has to be there for. It's more of I spent over an hour doing hand washing today, and that's how you get the quality, the criteria met. And if the way that this slide organized you bothers you, you might just like things well done and organized. And so you might get a giggle if you go and you read obsessive and compulsive personality disorder. I think it's also going to be pretty prevalent that you all are going to run into PTSD. And I think that probably coming back and doing just PTSD and trauma informed care would be enough of a talk for you all to do if you need something like that. Um, I think the discussion is more too about what we do about it and less about the diagnostic criteria for this one specifically. Um, when we talk about anhedonia, we're talking about this absence of feeling inside. People can have a hard time understanding it. So I try to break it down into normal language for people. Like apathy is lacking motivation. Ambivalence is unclear motivation or a mix of emotion at the same time. I'm not sure how I feel about it. Akathisia is like this internal shakiness that kind of like is energy or like quicksilver running through us that gets us alert and kind of agitated. And it's not usually something that's a pleasurable feeling. And then, like I said before, we give people about 2 weeks to 1 month. So with PTSD, because it's a trauma, we give you 1 month versus 2 weeks to recover from it. So some truths, the truths, I'm not sure, but these are very prevalent in existential thinking. I am alone. I will die. I need others. Just like asking questions about suicidality, saying those things out loud to yourself in front of a mirror to another human being is a powerful and weird, uncanny experience about what it activates at times inside. And we haven't totally figured out how to grasp consciousness. That's usually why there's all these ways of trying to prove that you're a human out there. One of the things that I've glommed onto that a supervisor gave me that I found very helpful is everyone is doing the best they can every day with the resources they have, and they can do better. That applies to people dying. That applies to people in power. That applies to me. That applies to you. We can all do better and different, and we're doing the best we can with what we have today. And we have to find a way to grab hold of that dialectic and work on accepting that piece. Or we can deny that anxious thought and feeling, and it can turn into a bigger problem later. So hopefully when the Zoom meeting started, you didn't all have a crushing sense of existential dread this morning. It's a rough topic at 7:30. But the big four collapse down, I think, pretty much every reason anybody comes into psychotherapy. Death and dying, my death, your death. Why do we die? Why do good people die? Why do bad people live? Um, what happens after we die? What happens before life? All of these big questions that can send us spinning and don't have necessarily something called a puso, something to stand on in life. The second one's isolation versus connectedness, freedom and responsibility or accountability, and meaning versus meaninglessness in the world. So, existential psychotherapy locates roots of human distress in these four things rather than in pathology alone. So, Yama proposes that much of our symptomatic suffering is an expression of defenses against conscious contact with these concerns. We almost have this revulsion to them of turning away. We would rather talk about vomit and feces than we would about these types of topics. The therapeutic task then is to not merely reduce the symptoms, but to deepen awareness, expand freedom of choice, and facilitate authentic engagement with life in the face of finiteness. Regardless of how much time there is left, there is still good and worthy time. It's kind of like a saying about it doesn't matter how how small hope is, it's still hope. it still exists. The existential model is very phenomenological and process oriented, and so it privileges lived experiences and here and now interaction and what's called the co-construction of reality and meaning over a mechanical diagnostics. It's going to say things like objectivity is a myth, there is only subjectivity. Rather than fitting a patient into a symptom category, the clinician asks how the illness, loss, and uncertainty reorganize the person's world of meaning, values, and relationships. So, what does this disease say about me? What does this disease say about my relationships with others and beyond? And what does this disease mean about my values? It can get too complicated and too deep. I like it a lot, and so I repeatedly had to kind of pull back. And so I'm definitely open for feedback from you all about if you wanted more, let me know and we can go much deeper about this stuff. But I'm not sure what your level of access is or what opportunities you have or haven't had with this type of thinking. And it can be very different. I always encourage people to just go into every encounter with an attitude of openness, curiosity, presentness, and flexibility. If you can do those things, you will move through most encounters relatively well. Another way to say that similar idea is to talk about kind of integration within ourselves. So if our thoughts sit in our mind, our emotions sit in our heart, our intuition sits in our gut, and our sexuality sits in our private areas, then when all of those parts are at the boardroom, when they're all talking and they have a voice, when they're heard and respected and safe, the way forward in life, decision making becomes not easy, but a little bit more clear. Is a little bit more certainty. We're a little bit more willing to make those choices versus when we have very disparate conversations happening, when the heart wants one thing, but the head wants another. We also have to figure out in that boardroom for the context that we're in, what is the weight or the loudness that each voice gets. Behaviorally, we want to be kind, be respectful, be safe. And if you do those things, you'll probably have fun. This for me has become a mantra that I say to my kids every morning. The other thing I challenge everybody I work with to do is to be kind to yourself. Be as kind to yourself in your head, or no, sorry, that's too big of a challenge. Be 50% as kind to yourself in your head as you are your patients. So be curious about the totality of life, the easy and the hard, the simple and the powerful, the power of relationships. Open yourself to the here and the now. We also call it the present moment or now moment. So these powerful and fleeting things that we experience typically in 5 minutes or less. Um, if we're observing the world and we're open, then we can experience and utilize those things with the power that they come with. And if we don't, then we miss out on these opportunities and we have to re-experience them at a future time when our system is more open to accepting and more willing to digesting. The good thing is everybody can cultivate that power. It's called the power to be, like with a capital B. I say negotiate and bend boundaries while never negotiating on aspects that lessen physical or psychological safety. And so when I work with residents and with clients, I tell them I will negotiate with you on every aspect of this, but safety. And when it comes to safety, I'm going to be a bit of a bulldog about it because I'm really centered on safety. That fits my personality style. And so a big piece of your takeaway too is how do I take the things that I've seen today and use it with my energy, with my patience? Because what I can say and get away with works for me, just like trying to say what you would do might bomb for me. So much of it goes back to compassionate honesty, a kind candor, a normalizing and validating that if you have lived their life, not yours, you could see their thoughts and feelings as valid. Now, that does not mean you're co signing their behavior, and it doesn't mean you respect the choices or that they wouldn't be abhorrent to make in your own life. But what they are valid expressions and reactions to life through the lens of liberty and freedom. I can see how you would go that way. People can and will make their own mistakes, so let them. Otherwise, you're just creating more emotional baggage for yourself to carry. You're also in a unique position in your field to have a really inside look at a part of life that a lot of people don't get. Just like OBGYNs that do labor and delivery have this very unique window into a special kind of 24-hour window of people's lives. You guys have a solid at least 30 to 90 days, I'm thinking in my head, of reverberations from with the patients that you see. And so you're going to learn over time what is normal, what is one, 1.5, two standard deviations above and below the mean. And then you can reflect that and give people a normalization and a validation and a psychoeducation that's real. It's research and evidence based, but it's also experience based. And people will love you for that type of responsiveness to their situation. Lean into the big four. Commonalities and fears are those of non existence, loss of self, being a burden, and collapse of identity or role. I think that this is a huge reason why physicians in the generation above you did not retire, are not retiring, and fear retirement. When my dad was a family physician, retired, he realized he had just accidentally stopped reading anything for fun, and all he read was medical stuff. He had accidentally devoted himself to this calling and to this career to such a level that he couldn't sit down and watch more than one episode on Netflix at a time. Now, don't worry, he is caught up and he will watch a whole season or two seasons or four movies in a day now. But I think that this is a huge problem, and I think it's part of what leads to the suicide risk with physicians. And so I definitely want to comment on it and acknowledge that it is there, and it's something that doesn't have to erode who we are and take away from us. One of the biggest things that I've had to get comfortable with as a psychologist is not always knowing what's in the room ahead of me and just going in with that same attitude I talked to you about. And so I look at myself like I'm a Swiss Army knife. I'll have whatever tool I have. And if I don't have a tool in here, I know I can go and ask my team. And so a big piece of that tool is just normalizing people's existence and letting them know this is not you being insane. This is actually a sane person responding to an insane world. Like if you've heard me do my wellness talk, one of the things that I say regularly is there is no system in America that was set up for you to be well. It's not healthcare, it's not legal, it's not judicial, it's not educational, it's not political. There is no social system that we've built that I've found that supports growth and well-being. So we have to find it, and the way that we do that is together. And so relief comes from using the self as a tool, meaning making conversations. It's turning conversations away from how's the weather into something that's got a little bit more legs to it. It's having this calm presence that shows up that says, I'm here. You don't have to take care of me. I've got my own team to do that. I'll take care of you, and I'm not looking away. And that ability to show up for people in that way supports a value-based service delivery line, which will give you huge gains of altruistic return, but it will also help your patients in their easing of their existential crises. So, kind of broadly applying an existential frame, people appreciate kind truth, and people like to know others, including us, struggle. People want black and white reality, and all I have to give you is gray and rainbow realities. It's okay to leave a conversation upset, dysregulated, angry, as long as you still felt safe and respected. If not, then I'll own that piece. And if you give me the opportunity to try again, I'll try better or different. And approaching people this way is a very existential way. And so you're presenting things very kind of openly and honestly. You're also operating from this place of what's called dialectics, which is from dialectical behavior therapy, or that's the place that it gets used most. And so it's these two things that seem opposite that actually are coexisting in the same space. So I hate knowing you because I met you this way, and I love that I had that opportunity. I'm really sad that the world's not going to get to learn from you because you're going to be dead. And I'm grateful for the gifts that you gave the world while you were here. It's a very practical way of sitting down with people. I think that a lot of faith-based leaders are very good at having conversations along those frames. And they are sources of support that we can lean on and pull into our interdisciplinary team too. In fact, I know our spiritual team wants to work more with residents, wants to serve residents more and fellows. So if you're interested in that or you need help in that area, reach out, let me know. And then it's about normalize, validate, and psychoeducate. Yeah. Okay. So now is like, how do we do this? So we want to invite, titrate, and metabolize truths as they emerge. So we normalize everything, including ambivalence. We have this presence of a here and now focus, this I won't look away attitude that removes shame from the situation. We have that curiosity and that truthfulness. Part of being truthful is stepping in when a patient misattributes things and says things like, I did this to myself, I gave myself this cancer. Like things that at a certain point, like it doesn't matter whose fault it is. We now have the responsibility here in this moment to face it together. So throwing around fault and blame at this point, you could try to live a perfect life in America and still die of cancer. You could do all the best you could to live a very like granola holistic life and still require significant amount of medical intervention. We don't have the power to do this or not this to ourselves. It's like we can't just manifest a reality we hope for. That's not how manifesting works. We have to be great observers and observers of reality as it is and not the reality that we want. And I think that that is a significant challenge and a skill set that you all will probably need in huge excess reserves. And you're going to get a lot of that mental toughness and growth mindset and neuroplasticity developed in things like mindfulness. Um, the authenticity, what I want to say about self disclosure is self disclosure needs to be intentional and it needs to be something that we do for the patient. And so we need to think about it. We need to kind of plan it out in our head, and then we need to say it. And if it doesn't pass that test, then I hold that self disclosure back. I also treat touch in the same way. Is this about their treatment? Do I think that this will help? How will I think this will help? When we try to sit in a space when others are unwilling, our transparency and honesty are the healing agents. And so when we normalize an ambivalence, it protects against loss. When we replace right decision thinking with best aligned decision for who you are and what matters now, we're allowed to revisit choices as it evolves. Um, the truth is, these people are already sitting in it. So asking them to sit down and look at the narrative and challenge it and explore it is really just acknowledging where they already are. Back with authenticity. Just like Boost Bar and Trazodone, I find a lot of people hate those, and I think they hate them because they don't supply a big kick. Like if you've ever had a benzo, you're never gonna like those because you never feel them kick in. But over time, the thing just kind of titrates and metabolizes and massages out these issues, and that's the way the authenticity will be in your practices. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Self-disclosure is judicial, intentional, and with the purpose for the patient. That's a better frame for you. If you can sit down into values, you can start to learn how to coach families to replace things like you'll be fine with truthful compassion. We're with you, we'll face it together. Those things end up feeling better and feeling more, just like empathy feels better than pity or sympathy. We also have to be the holders of hope. And I would say when your hope vessel gets too low, then you seek out consultation, supervision, vacation, me, Trinity Health, physician coach. There are a lot of sources to help you restore your hope. That is not something that you want to let run out. Neither do you want to engage in premature reassurances or despair. We have to be the people in the middle. We can't succumb to these ideas of panic, of there's no hope and it's just despair and nihilistic destruction and meaninglessness. And neither do we want to be the Pollyannas running around telling everybody it's going to be just fine and they're probably going to go home. We always want to look for areas to empower. And within empowerment, you can do things like anchoring work. If you're familiar with breath work, grounding, things like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, rituals and routines, or existential acres. There's different activities that you can do around looking at values and how do I select a value and then start putting behavioral aspects into that so I can start living the value versus living out of fear. Attachment comes up in this area again. And so it's going to help you see consistent and predictable patterns both with individuals and with their families and with the teams. It's going to give you keys about how to approach it. You don't have to fix it. The person's not broken. It's how do I manage dealing or interacting with this person? Avoidant response styles or avoidant attachment styles are ones that kind of lean out of relationships. They generally respond well to gentle, concrete, repeated invitations. They're not going to respond well to force. It's kind of like a dog. If you go and you run in, you've never seen them, and you run up and try to pet it, it's going to run away from you. Versus if you just sit down and put your hand down low, it'll probably come up and smell you in 3 seconds. Anxious styles, we're going to need to emphasize reliability and co-regulation. We're going to get through this together. This is predictable in the sense that there are keys and strategies and ways to look at this, even though we are unclear on why and what your triggers are. And disorganized history prioritizes safety and stabilization. We're going to calm these things down. We're going to get a plan in place. We're going to work together. Safety is my number one thing. And then those either patients or that family is going to relax on you, and that's going to better allow you to do your work. That's going to allow you to not take home as much on your shoulders at the end of the day. I'm not sure how much you all have had about motivational interviewing. Uh, MI is about learning how to be a guide in relationships. It's how to avoid something called the writing reflex, where we have to fix it, where we think we know best or that we have the power to make change happen. MI is a way of having conversations where we're constantly doing something called rolling with resistance or not biting on the hook invitations that we're given or resisting and being aware of transference and countertransference processes in the relationship. Rolling with resistance is an easier way to think, I'm not going to fight against what they're telling me to do. And so that's why it's so effective with substance use, but it can be very effective in hospice and palliative care as well, and really in relationship. And the other piece of it is this idea of I'm constantly handing anxiety back to you to deal with. I'm constantly looking and encouraging discrepancies in your cognitions and then handing them back for you to explain to me. That way, you're having to do the work of building insight and doing then cognition change. So, we want a partnership with them. They're the expert in their self, you're the guide and subject matter expert. You want to give acceptance, and you do that through something called unconditional positive regard. The way that I think about it and practiced it when I worked with people who did engage in domestic violence and were in probation, is that these individuals had chosen choices that were very antisocial, hurt people, were bad, objectively bad choices. I had to figure out a way to have a relationship with them. And using this strategy was I love you as a human being, and you don't need to go any further than that to deserve me saying you have worth, me saying that that worth also entitles you to safety. And so if you can give somebody this idea that they are worthy just by the very existence that they were born into a life they did not choose, you give them accurate enough empathy. It's just like good enough parenting. There is no perfect. We got to get rid of that idea. I wish that Mickey Mouse Clubhouse would stop saying it's the best day ever and the best Easter ever, because it's just setting kids up to have this idea that everything has to be the best ever and nothing can be, that was fun. That was an average amount of fun, and an average amount of fun is good or acceptable or pleasurable. Um, Autonomy supports always supporting and working and empowering and affirming any direction that they take, whether it's mentally or behaviorally, just really giving them a lot of affirmations. We want to maintain compassion by promoting patient welfare, advocating and prioritizing their patient needs. And then the bulk of MI is in evocation. Um, it's constantly kind of being enough sandpaper that people will stay engaged in the conversation, but that you're rubbing away some of their defenses and encouraging them to let other things come out and emerge. And those things that you're eliciting are their strengths in spite of them telling you they're weak, their motivations in spite of you hearing motivated behavior, in spite of them saying they don't have values or resources as you highlight what resource and values they have already told you about. MI also uses something called ORS, which is just a way of reflecting when someone says something to me, how can I respond? And that's going to be with open ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. Reflections are things like, wow, that sounds, or I wonder if you feel, or oh my goodness, like those, like, hey, I'm listening and showing you that. A summary is going to give them back what the information they give you, and you can do that in various ways with different nuance and different combinations, and that can be, again, a whole other thing we do. The other tools that you can use from MI, I think, in this space are something called a decision or balance grid to help kind of lay out thoughts and look at them on paper. Things like a readiness ruler. How ready are you to do this treatment today? They say that they're a 3. You ask them why they're not a 1, or you ask them what it would take to get to a 4 or a 5. Instead of saying, well, you're a 3, how could we get you to a 10 today? Which is more of like a, how can I supersize your value meal strategy? Ask about extremes and explore past successes. So, one of the things I want to touch on before we end here is this idea of what cost to me. You all have chosen a field where you are going to rub up against secondary trauma all the time. And so you need to be aware of that. We need to speak honesty to that, and that it does have an impact on us. And that impact is one that we can't measure, and it's transitory, and it depends on so many factors, including what's going on in our own lives. And so I want you to really be thinking about yourself as you do this work. There is a psychiatrist, Dan Siegel, that I really like that talks about um, integration and embodied relationality. And one of his things is this idea of me plus we is mui. And the only way that we get through this is with mui. And a way to think about that on a little bit more material level would be to say we interact and influence and integrate and imitate and include each other, much like organs work together to build an organ system. And then those organ systems interact with other aspects of the system. And so acknowledge your own vulnerability, use the team. Work on self awareness as much as your patients are thinking about death and dying, isolation, meaninglessness, connectedness, attachment, authenticity, all these things we've been talking about. You need to be thinking about them too. You need to be engaging with them, journaling about them, consulting, and processing through it. And there's also ways that you can set up those types of structures within your community. And I highly encourage that and would be willing to help with that as well. Uh, Having this idea of a relational presence that grounds our presence and co-regulates our distress in other people. And then self-care is a huge category in and of itself. We're learning how to do that better and better, but we're still not at a place that I would say that we're beyond like a C grade. So I think it takes a lot of balance, and that balance is both work and privately. It's also balance between how you engage in service versus personal growth versus meaning making activities. It's engaging in meaning making activities versus just doing something to do it or just doing something because that's the schedule. And it's practicing self reflecting. You can journal, you can process with others, you can engage with the big four. There's no shortage of ways that we could design and figure out ways to do self reflecting. Those are just a couple examples. And then these last couple things are just some things to help you continue to think about what are some things that we could do. And so I don't think that you all have to become the psychologist that does a lot of the psychotherapeutic work about existential care and change, or narrative work, or these things called mortality dialogues. But I think you should be aware that they exist because it's going to be something that you can keep as part of your tool bank where you can then have that in your back pocket. And maybe that works better than a medication does. Maybe calling in spiritual care or a psychologist or social worker gets you better outcomes than a different tool that you have in your toolbox. And so, in these types of dialogues, we explore images of dying and death, fears, hopes. We look at legacy and continuity. We look at rituals and symbols. We look at body based regulation, micro choices. A lot of times, residents complain about a lack of time and control over their schedule, and there's this part of me that wants to like coddle them and hold them and care for them and say, yes, let's get you more time. And there's part of me that says, well, wait till you have kids and wait till you have micro time, where you have to figure out these micro moments of your sanity or how to take care of yourself. I think suffice to say that with development, things just gain over time. So like responsibility doesn't ever get taken away, it just grows. We just get better at dealing with hard responsibility. So these conversations and approaching the big four with your patients will get better or easier over time, and feel less sticky, feel less heavy, feel harder to engage with and bring up, or feel easier to engage with and bring up, excuse me. And then family work is the last one there. And I already talked about um, coordinating with everybody else. So sometimes residents want to know, or fellows want to know, like, what is some like practical language? If you want to do cases with me, that's something that we can do. We can look at potential dialogues. We can do that through role plays. We can do that through letting Copilot create a dialogue for us, and then we like process or evaluate and explore it together. So these are some questions that are kind of out there to start prompting people to look kind of beyond the diagnostic checklist and looking at what are some other things that we could be looking at and thinking about with our patients. What are some questions that we might be able to ask like a key, and open up a new place where we can get with these folks to help them die with dignity, to help them transition with a little bit more resolution in this life than maybe they otherwise would to have this last empowerment and liberty of looking into the world and going out as much on their own as they can. Some other things that then we would want to spend to think about is how people will really process and think about and approach this. When we talk about grief and death, if you're not aware, grief is kind of the internal feelings that we're having about it, while mourning is the outward behavioral expression of it. Sometimes families need that language to have an idea about, well, what should I be doing when I go home? Another huge topic that I started to get into and ended up taking out of this presentation was just grief and loss and how those relate to existential isolation. I think that there's both just the loss of patients dying, but there's also this idea of ambiguous loss, unexpected loss, losses that we're a part of or contributing to. Um, these things that are less clear cut around death and dying, or these more nuanced or ambiguous types of losses, almost like things like miscarriages or loss of functionality through an acquired disability. That is spaces that this type of thinking is absolutely applicable to as well. A couple resources for you if this is interesting for you and you want to chase down some more information about this. I did not talk about the second one at all, but I think that NPR life kits do a really good job of making these giant topics into bite-sized pieces, and they've got stuff about most aspects of life in there. So I recommend that. And then you can't get it now because I have it at my house, but I will return it soon. This Handbook of Psychiatry and Palliative Care was awesome. And looking at this and thinking about how do we move forward, they've got chapters specifically for anxiety and depression. If I didn't go deep enough into one of those and you want more, they've got how do we do this? How do we think about it? And so I would really recommend that. And then I don't always use references from the 80s. This book was actually republished in the 80s. It was published in, I think, 1931 or something like that. Irvin Yalom wrote this book, and it has basically become the Bible in psychology, and no one has come up with a better book since. So I would also highly recommend that, though I will tell you it is a huge tome. So I've had it for years. I've probably read 98% of it, but there's still sections of it that I haven't completed. So that one is a very good resource, but just to let you know, it is a giant task. Does anybody have any questions, comments, feedback for me, things that you wanted that you didn't get?
Well, I can start us off with a question. As I'm thinking about this, with the existential piece of it in particular, you mentioned legacy and some of those other things. One of the things that I've come across is dignity therapy as well. How often does that come up in the literature, or how often do you see that practiced? And are there practical tips for us to try to carry some of that out ourselves?
Yeah, I dignity therapy is going to basically everything that we talked about today applies into that same idea. Is if you can give somebody kindness and respect and psychological and physical safety, then what will emerge from that is a willingness to digest things. For some people, it's going to be more legacy and future planning. For some people, it's going to be blame and shame about how I got here. For some people, it's going to be guilt and shame around this is happening, or I've completely lost like aspects of my functionality, like I can't go to the bathroom by myself anymore. And what does that mean about my dignity, and how do we approach that? And is a lot of normalization and validation. The thing I didn't talk about that would be a huge part of dignity therapy for me is humor. We're going to step into this space and we're going to talk about it. We're going to cry about it. We're going to laugh at it. We're going to massage it. We're going to cut it up and look at it in all these ways. Because what we're going to find out is that these are things happening to me and around me, but that is not a measure of a human's worth.
Thank you. Rachel,
That
you have
work
your hand
typically
up.
takes time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. It was really fascinating on so many levels, so I appreciate it. Just curious if you have any, especially with your background in family medicine and all that, working with adolescents and young adults, like in the maybe 13 to 30-year-old range. That could be a whole other lecture in and of itself, but just
Yeah, it
quick tips.
can. I thought about that. I thought about looking at so this is one way to think about it. We have a term for children who have lost their parents, which is orphan. We have a term for like couples who have lost like a widow or a widower, but we don't have a term for parents who have lost a child. It's either because it's so rare it doesn't happen, we don't have a term for it, or it happens so much, but it's so horrible we can't place a term on it. And I think it's that one. So I think part of it is when the teen goes through this themselves, and what does that mean, and how do we talk about not necessarily legacy, but like the loss of a legacy or what was stolen from this person essentially. So yes, adolescence would be a huge other thing because there's the part of them that is in it themselves as the patient, or it's the part of them as the survivor, as the person who lives on after a parent has had this happen to them. And that opens up a whole host of other things for them. My wife is a social worker, and she has somebody that has been in hospital palliative care, but she's also now recovered. And so she's out. So she's one of these rare kids too, who has just this interesting perspective where there's times where her heart just is not doing well and she sneaks back down. And then for whatever reason, she recovers. And so for her, there's this added thing of, am I okay? Am I not okay? Am I safe to do this? Am I not safe to do that? And how does that relate to then how much I isolate myself or how much I refuse to engage in relationships? Because what's the point? Yeah, I'm going to die tomorrow, or they're going to be too overwhelmed by my stuff.
That's so great. And I just talking about the loss of what could have been. I think we talk sometimes with families, and I've heard this from other people, is just the losing an older person is losing their past and their history, and losing a child is losing their future and what could have been.
Yeah.
Anyways, just I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Our mind will spin out with that too and create all these counterfactuals, these what if and if onlys. And that can really weigh us down and just pull us into existential dread. I'm aware that you guys have something after this. I want to be respectful of that. If you all have questions or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Teams, or you can find me through email.